All right, the little QR code in the corner, you can scan that to make questions pop up here. This is the Slido app. I was never sure if it was Slido or Slido. Okay, so if you want to put questions in there, you can also raise your hands and ask questions. That's also fine. So before we get into my talk, a little about me. I'm Chad O. That is how I pronounce my username also around the internet. I'm Chad OH, but Chad O. Co-founder and CEO of AHA Labs. Previously, I started my career in Ruby on Rails, which informs my thinking on joyful developer tooling. And right before joining the Stellar ecosystem, I was in the Near ecosystem, helping build out Near. So that informed that they had their own ideas about like good developer tooling and some things to compare and contrast with Stellar. So let's get into the talk. It's changed a little bit from the description that's in the app. So it's not all about dApp tooling. There's some just regular Stellar tooling, but there's also just how Stellar optimizes for joy. So let's talk about this word, joy. If you type in :joy : in GitHub or Slack or wherever you can type in emojis like this, you get this one. This always seemed a little like too ecstatic to me. If you Google image search joy, you get a lot of this character. Raise a hand who knows who this is. All right, I didn't. This is a character named Joy from the movie Inside Out. You also get a lot of lens flare, people jumping for joy or like spinning on mountaintops or in front of the ocean. You also get, this is ChatGPT, image of pure joy. This is what it gave me. You got like people dancing in a field with balloons and flowers and more lens flare. This all feels kind of like the laughing face emoji with the tears coming out, right? Like this ecstatic form of joy. There's also some that are a little more like calm, just sort of a feeling of delight maybe, right? In the rain, but still feeling good. So there's a couple different competing definitions of joy, I feel. There's the intense and especially ecstatic or exultant happiness, or an instance of such a feeling. This is the joy emoji. Then there's also the emotion evoked by well-being, success, or good fortune, or by the prospect of possessing what one desires, delight. Or maybe even more relevant for developer tooling, a source or cause of delight. This is the kind of joy that I think Stellar's dApp tooling, Stellar's tooling evokes. So let's get into it. Stellar, we're going to talk about reasons that, or things that I find joyful about working on Stellar. That it has real value and real utility, familiar developer workflows, built-in programmability. We'll talk about two examples, a command line example and an app example. And finally, you. All right, so real value, real utility. Blockchains, what are they good for? Actually, maybe I could like ask the audience, what do you think blockchains are good for? There's a lot of like bad arguments for blockchains, I feel like, especially 7 years ago, maybe there were a lot of like, it's going to usher in world peace and end poverty and stuff like that. I go for a like humbler argument for what blockchains are good for, right? As with data, so with value. So the previous 30 years was kind of about the internet eating anywhere you saw information moving around in the early 90s, the web eventually took over that information distribution, right? And in the early 90s, maybe people thought that was going to happen really fast. They thought like newspapers were all going to be online, publications, stuff like that. But it kind of took about 30 years for that to be fully realized, that like now the web software is how information moves around. I think over the next 30 years, I see a strong argument for value moving into software, into blockchains in that same way. So money, ownership, governance, right? Anywhere you see these things moving around, rules around money, anywhere you see that happening in the world, I think blockchains are like a more useful way for that to happen. And blockchains will sort of like consume this movement of value. It'll all happen via blockchains. This is not necessarily a joyful prognosis, right? Like the movement of information all moving onto the internet was not pure upside. There were pros and cons to doing that. And I would expect the same for the movement of value. But still, it feels good to be in an ecosystem that has real-world utility, right? In Stellar, it's not just money games for rich people like it is in a lot of other blockchain ecosystems. There's people building like useful stuff for common people. There's MoneyGram and the UN Refugee Commission and a whole bunch of apps, more than I could list here, that are being used by regular people. And the fact that smart contracts are now on Stellar means that you have almost a decade, or I guess a full decade, of real value to build on in smart contracts, right? Like all of these assets, all of these use cases are there to be built on top of. So that brings me joy, that there's real value, real stuff happening in the Stellar ecosystem. So let's go on to familiar developer workflows. In Near, you have to actually deploy your contracts to the testnet in order to work against them. I think this is similar in Ethereum. In Stellar and Sorbonne, we've got the Stellar Network Container command, so you can build on everything locally, right? Everywhere in other ecosystems, like before I was in Web3, you always build stuff locally before you deploy it to a staging environment. So the Stellar Network Container gives you Horizon, RPC, and FriendBot all in one. What's this do for you? It means you don't need Ganache or whatever in order to run a local development environment. It gives you a controlled environment for tests. And in the future, it'll even have some UI in there. So you can have a block explorer built in, and it's all just in the main tool that you use to build stuff. So that's a little bit about familiar developer workflows. This is my favorite spot. This is the part of the talk that's closest to the original description in your agenda. What is not joyful? I did that a little too soon. ABIs, right? ABIs do not bring me joy. So if you don't know what ABIs are, this is application binary interfaces. In Ethereum, this is a JSON file that describes all of the methods in a smart contract, all the arguments that those methods take, the return values, what events get emitted when you call it. And they're not published in any central place, right? It's just developers can publish them somewhere. A lot of people end up using the Etherscan API. But then this introduces another endpoint that you need to call if you're going to build developer tooling, right? And it's not reliably there. So it's hard to like make use of the ABIs in the most productive, joyful way. So what is more joyful is baking it in, right? In Stellar smart contracts, the ABI is deployed right on chain from day one. They've all been there, so you know that they're there, and you can build really good developer tools. They call it it is called the contract spec in Stellar. So if you see contract spec around, this is like the ABI in Ethereum. And it lets us make really slick developer tools. For example, if you use Stellar contract init and initialize a new project with the increment example contract, it'll have this method in it. Pub function increment, it returns a U32, and it's got this comment. Comments are also included in the contract spec that's published on chain. So we can build our contract, we can deploy it with an alias, by the way. Alias also brings me joy. Shout out to Nando for all the work with alias. And then whenever you invoke it, you put in this, do I have a little, no, there's no laser beam in here to point at it. Anyway, you got the alias is used there, -- ID counter, and then you've got the -- here. This is a bunch of different tools use the -- in this way, like cargo run or npm run, or I forget, there's other ones that I've seen. So the stuff that comes after it is all sent to like the sub-process. The sub-process here is a CLI that's built on the fly from the smart contract, right? Stellar CLI is going to fetch the smart contract, parse the contract spec, pull out all of the information about what methods it has, and then all of those methods are going to be commands on this implicit CLI that's built on the fly. So whenever you type in -- help, you get all of the commands that it runs, which this contract only has one right now, increment, and the help command, which we see here. So, and then all of this, the comments here, right? Increment increments an internal counter and returns the value. That's from the comment that the smart contract author put in. Ethereum ABIs do not put in those comments. So then we know that we can invoke it with -- space increment. So let's change this a little bit and see how that would change this interaction. I think that helps understand what's going on here. First, let's clean up the comment, increment counter return new value. Let's add an argument. So increment counter by and return the new value. So now you can increment it by 5, say. And let's add another method for good measure. So we'll add a get method, which is going to return the value of the counter. If we build and deploy and invoke, and now we do our -- help, we'll see that we have 2 real methods, increment and get. And now if we do counter -- space increment -- help, you even have the help information for all of those subcommands, for all of the methods in it, right? So now we see the increment counter by again, but we also see all of the options that it takes. And there's a -- by, right? The argument to it matches the argument name in the original smart contract. So now we know we can invoke it with counter -- increment -- by 5. If you think about aliasing that whole thing in Bash, right, setting up an alias, it looks even more like a regular CLI, right? It's just a counter command line interface. So counter -- help, counter increment -- help, counter increment -- by 5. All right, so over in JavaScript to do this, you would import the client from Stellar SDK /counter. And then you can say counter equals client from contract ID, and you would need to put in which network it's on. And then you can do counter.increment by 5. So this looks very similar. But what you're missing here is all of those comments from the original contract author. If you want that, you've got to use TypeScript. So this is where Stellar Contract Bindings comes in. Stellar Contract Bindings TypeScript, ID counter, right? We aliased it as counter. If you do not have that alias, you would have to put in the ID from the actual network and which network it's on. We're going to put it in packages /counter. This can be used with workspaces in NPM or Yarn. So it adds it as an NPM module to your local project. And then you can import client and networks from that packages /counter, right? That's the name of the package. And then when you instantiate it, counter equals new client, and you can say .networks.testnet. That puts in the ID and the network passphrase for you. You would still have to bring your own RPC URL. But then you get all of the type ahead that you're used to with any NPM package, right? Counter dot, and you get the get method and the increment method. Down here at the end is the comments from the contract author. Increment counter by, return new value. And you can't quite see it in the contrast on the screen, but it does have syntax highlighting on it, that second by, which makes it make a little more sense. And then if you actually type in .increment, you get a whole bunch more, right? It's the same as the increment -- help on the CLI. You see that kind of information for how to use this method. So again, this is going back to the second definition of joy that I showed, where it gets out of your way, it lets you figure out what you need to do. It gives you these familiar developer patterns where it's just like, there's some contract that I want to build against, maybe I didn't even write it, and I can generate this library for it and figure out how to work with it. Certainly brings me joy. That's built-in programmability. Let's talk about you. So I have a call to action here. Don't just build apps, build tooling. You have all of the foundations you need to build tooling here. You've got the technological foundations, right? So if you want to see how those CLI, that implicit CLI is built, You can go here to the Rust source code for the CLI and see how it's done. If you want to see how the TypeScript bindings parse the CLI, parse the contract spec, not the CLI, parse the contract spec and give you all of that type ahead information, you can go to that one. You also have the financial foundations that you need. The Stellar Community Fund actually has a dev tooling track. So scan that, get more information. If you want to build dev tooling, if you've got ideas for other, right, not just the CLI and JavaScript, but if you want to do other stuff with these bindings or other stuff with the contract spec or other dev tooling in general, plugins for the CLI or whatever, go make it happen. You've also got the community foundations you need, right? There's a bunch of other cool projects in this ecosystem. Okashi, CommuniDAO, Loam, that's another one that Aha Labs is making. You can come see me again tomorrow to learn more about Loam. So again, if you've got ideas, build on Stellar. That's it. Any questions here? I will check Slido. What is the current biggest challenge you are most interested in solving? I think that might have been for you, but it was up here when I got started. You want me to answer it?
Do you want to take questions from the people?
Yeah, any questions from the audience? All right. So, biggest challenge that I'm most interested in solving. Go ahead, Tomer. Yeah, so one thing that I think I mentioned but maybe forgot was, yes, thank you, Tomer. I will repeat the question. I worked at Near. What is, like, compare and contrast the joy level of Near versus Stellar. So one thing that I talked about is that in Near, there's no local development, right? In order to do development on Near, you're sort of expected to deploy everything, your contracts to testnet. Which, like, sort of works, but it doesn't feel natural to me from, like, the non-Web3 world. So that's like a point in the Stellar column. Actually, another point in the Stellar column. We'll do more in the Stellar column first. Cross-contract calls are just, like, straightforward and what you would expect in Stellar. So cross-contract calls is one smart contract makes a call to another smart contract to, like, read a value or change something. And then if that cross-contract call fails, the original call fails, and it all just gets automatically, like, unraveled, right? I forget the actual word for that. So it's the same as a database interaction, right? They're atomic transactions. In Near, it's the scaling model of Near doesn't allow that, so a cross-contract call happens in a follow-up block. So in block 1, you make your first call, that contract calls another contract, that happens in block 2. If that fails, then it can schedule a follow-up call back to the original contract in block 3, and it's up to the developer to, like, undo whatever was done in block 1. So that's, like, a much harder challenge for the developer than having actual atomic transactions. One thing that Near has that I really love and miss is account names that are built in. So you've got, like, chado.near, right, as like as built into the runtime itself, built into the, why can't I think of the word that I want? It's like an operation to have the, you know, to create a new account name, and then you can have sub-accounts. So I can have, like, I don't know, myapp.chado.near or something like that. So in Stellar, this is done in the same way as it's done in a lot of other blockchains. It's done via smart contracts, which is fine. It works, and I think we'll learn a lot more in Tyler's talk later about cool capabilities that sort of maybe, like, leapfrog the, right, like using passkeys. We might be sort of leapfrogging the need for those named accounts. So maybe it's like a temporary downside until the tooling gets even better. What's that? You have to get funded first before you can create a named account, or, like, the named account in Near, you need to you need to have some funding. You need someone to have some funding already to create your named account for you. Right. You can't have an account without some funding. Yeah, that's a good point. Yes. Oh, there's a microphone now.
Thank you. So what exactly do you do, and what's the hardest thing that you've, done?
What exactly do I do, and what's the hardest thing that I've done? In the Stellar ecosystem?
Yes.
So AHA Labs, my team, they're all sitting right in front of you. We built like the whole implicit CLI that I showed off when you call Stellar contract invoke. That was all built by Willem right here. We've done a lot to maintain the CLI and add new features to the CLI. We also built the Stellar contract bindings TypeScript, the generated library that you get. That was all sort of imagined and created by us. Most challenging thing that I've done. Honestly, so like all the I think it's just when you change context, there's a challenge, right? So we've been heads down building all of these developer tools where it's like a bunch of obvious needs and we're working on it. And then I sort of like switched to actually building a smart contract on Stellar, right? And now it's like, oh, I actually I have barely done this, and it turns out like there's a different sort of like tool set needed in order to build smart contracts. So it's not that it's like an insurmountable challenge. It's just whenever you change from one thing to another. I think that's been more recently I've been helping more with building actual smart contracts for an SCF project called Equidex, who are right there, by the way. Hello. And actually switching to like smart contract developer mode was like more bumpy than I expected. Other questions? Oh, I'll check again on here. I guess that was the Slido question. What is the current biggest challenge you're most interested in solving? Can I count that? Who asked that question? Do you want to? All right, Willem. So maybe it was for me. Current biggest challenge that I'm interested in solving. I feel like there's still a lot of work to do around this developer tooling stuff, right? Like it's getting pretty good, but specifically with like Loam that I'll talk about tomorrow, it's almost at the point where we've kind of gotten it as smooth as makes sense with the core tooling, and then to make it smoother than that, you get into like convention over configuration stuff that's like more informed by my Ruby on Rails history. And that's where something like Loam comes in, right? It's like a bunch of opinionated tools built with those core tools. And there could be multiple ways to solve that problem. I think we're at time. I was just told that I had 1 minute, probably like 2 minutes ago now. So thank you all very much. Back to you,
Thanks, Chad.